historically, in midterms, voter turnout amongst progressives has been historically and really bad. The problem with that is that on the comparative, those who are voting Conservative, often in midterms, are still motivated to turn out and vote. As such, Democrats often do incredibly badly at these midterm elections. This is compounded by the fact that at the moment, these Democrats, at the platform on which they are campaigning, what is stale? It is the remnants of the Clinton-esque policy that has been so prevalent for such a long period of time. These people are seen as stale, and we need something new in order to change that. Because the problem is that the swing to the Democrats isn't assured, and we don't think that they are likely or assured to take a house in the first place. They need something new, they need something different. That comes when you actively promote these minorities into these positions. I want to note three things in context for the first. The first is that the voter turnout for these progressives is incredibly low. We don't think that any way centrists will vote. They are unlikely to vote anyway. You probably can't convince them to vote, but the problem is that you need to convince those progressives to vote in the first place. They aren't convinced by this particular rhetoric. We think that minorities often in presidential elections vote out incredibly strongly, but that is low historically in these midterm elections. I think that the second thing to note here is that people don't now think that the Democrats are out of touch. They are a stale, they aren't particularly new, and they aren't interesting, and they are unlikely to actually connect with voters in a particularly strong way. But then thirdly, I think that the problem is in the context of Trump with this racist rhetoric, it is incredibly important right now that something changes. What does this look like? It looks like when the Democrats select their pre-selected candidates and they are close between weighing up between two candidates, they always select the minority one. It also looks like things like affirmative action and quotas within the Congress, and then also promoting minorities into significant positions. We think that this mostly looks like race, but it is also things like sexuality, disability, low socioeconomic status. Because I want to note that at the midterm there is going to be a likely swing Democrat in response to Trump, but they are no shoo-in to actually do particularly well, and they are no shoo-in certainly to take the House or to do well in the Senate. I'm going to do three things in this speech. Firstly, talk to you why the Democrats are obligated to do this. Secondly, why they will do it better and why they will do better at the elections. And then secondly, why it's better for policy and government. So first on obligation. I want to note firstly that we think that the Democrats have historically and for a long period of time founded and campaigned on a principle of inclusivity and progressivism. We think that that needs to be mirrored in the types of candidates that they select. The second thing to say here is that the Democrats historically are people and have been voted for historically by a lot of minorities in the first place. And we think that the overrepresentation now needs to be a backlash against the historic underrepresentation that these voters who for so long have actually voted Democrat actually see. But then the third thing to say here is that the Democrats actively leverage that inclusivity and progressivism to get that minority vote, and as such need to respond in a way that shows them that they are willing to campaign and are willing to give these people, these actual people which represent them in a really good way. Secondly, why they are likely to do it better. Because I want to note that centrists are incredibly unlikely to vote in these midterm elections. The point at which you are forced to vote, these centrists are not politically motivated. They have significant apathy towards the political system. We think that it is important, therefore, that the Democrats need to turn their vote to progressives and to people on the left. Because African Americans are also people who are unlikely to vote at midterm elections. We have seen this in historic voting patterns. The other thing that's really important to note here is that they did not vote for Clinton in the elections. What they did is that they voted against Trump. They were incredibly reluctant to vote for Clinton in the elections, rather it was just a response to Trump. I think the first thing to say here is that the House Republicans are unlikely to be platforming on the same kind of campaign that Trump ran. I think that they're far more likely to be campaigning on a traditional kind of platform that was likely to have been seen previously in the Bush administration and those years. That is going to be traditional conservatism and the like. As such, there is not going to be that motivation for African American people to turn out against Trump and therefore vote for Hillary. We think that that is unlikely to occur at midterms. They are less motivated to go out and vote for the Democrats in response and to try and stop conservatism from getting into play, because we think that they are far more apathetic to that in the first place. I think the second thing to note here is that you are more likely to
vote for candidates at which you think you can have some kind of representation and some kind of relatability towards. Because note, the comparative is the rich old white man who you are far less likely to represent or identify with than someone who who is a minority and you actually can represent and you can identify with. We also think that you can identify if they are a different type of minority to you because there is that form of oppression that you are likely to feel. Then the third thing to say here is that even if it is about getting these centrists to vote, we think that they're far more likely to vote on the outside of the House. I think that's because of the apathy that is likely to be seen at the moment is a response towards the staleness and the unchangingness of the Democratic Party. We think that at the point at which they are likely to be apathetic, what you need is a really strong rhetoric that is likely to get them onto that side. I think that is more likely to occur at the point at which you have this kind of rhetoric that is incredibly strong, that is incredibly motivated, that is more likely to come from minorities, and it is more likely to come from people who have felt historical oppression. Because I want to note that you cannot underestimate how powerful this social rhetoric is. Because in the world at the moment, people are turning out in droves for things like protests and social justice campaigns. The problem is that that isn't being translated into turning out for things like election campaigns and campaigning for the Democrats as well. We think that at the point at which you have these minorities who can use these really powerful stories, who can talk about the oppression that they have felt and the responses to that, you're far more likely to connect that campaigning and that drive for social justice with these kinds of people. That social rhetoric is always more likely to manifest at the point at which you have these minority candidates. But then thirdly, why this is better for policy and government. Because even if they don't win a majority within the House, and even if they don't get a huge swing in the Senate at the point at which they control it, we still think that you are more likely to get more minority people in Congress. That's because the Democrats are likely to put up minority candidates in places which are probably shoo-ins for Democrats to get elected. What can they do? They can do a few things. I think the first thing is that they can push for social reform in a really powerful way. They can lobby the government arm and they can introduce bills in really powerful ways. But then the second thing is that they act as a really good check on government power, because note that in the US, the types of voting is not the same and is other places where you're always likely to vote down party lines. I think that is less likely to happen in Congress, and at the point that is true, it's really good that you have a strong minority caucus which can push back against any bills that are likely to be racist or any bills that are likely to be incredibly poor for minorities. Then the second thing to say here is that minority groups won't actually have that presence and have that power unless you have this kind of active push from the Democrats. We think that they just don't have the mobilization and the force that is required to actually get them into those positions in the first place. Then the third thing to say is that I think that the Democrats become far more effective when talking about and against the kind of rhetoric that Trump has and Trump uses. I think that if a rich old white man stands up and tries to talk against the immigration policy of Trump, it is far less likely to be convincing than if you have an immigrant or you have a minority talking about how racist that policy is, talking about how it affects them. Because that causal story and that really emotive, visceral story is far more likely to be connected with voters, it is far more likely to be powerful. Then the fourth thing is that I think you can capture a group of minorities who aren't into this left-wing social justice policies because they are more likely to associate with the right, because they don't associate with things like Black Lives Matter. Even if this goes badly, in the long term it is likely to be better. Because now they are viewed as weak, they are viewed as stale, the Democrats are viewed as not being able to change. Looking forward, that narrative has to change. That only changes when you actively promote minorities. So proud to be both.
That team was right to spend large chunks of their speech talking about how the Democratic Party was stale. But the reason why it's stale was wrong on that side of the House. The reason why the Democratic Party is stale and hasn't had success is because they're seen as this enormous, decision-making body that just pushes forward the candidates it wants without checking with voters what sort of candidates they want and what sort of voters they are likely to have. And that's a lot of rhetoric that Trump brought into in his campaign when he criticised the Democratic Party for pushing Clinton and ignoring Sanders, and that's the exact kind of rhetoric that turned Sanders voters into Trump voters and developed a lot of support in that regard. The Democratic Party, as bad as it sounds, needs to revert to some form of democratic populism within its own electorate and get candidates who are likely to succeed in this incredibly vital time for democratic success in the American political context. 3 points for you today. Firstly, what the obligation of the Democrats is particularly to the public. Secondly, why meritocratic selection will work best in this case. And thirdly, how this empowers how what they're doing empowers problematic narratives for the Republicans in this case. Firstly, though, let's do some responses. 2 points in response. Firstly, what is the context of this election? And secondly, who is the most likely to get political success? Firstly, what is the context of this election? They contended, and this was what a large chunk of their analysis was based on, was that these midterm elections would be relatively uncontested, and people frankly don't give a shit. Well, that would go fly in the face of any of the reality of the American political context for the last 2 years, because Trump's positioning has made him incredibly galvanizing and has encouraged Democrats more than ever to go out and vote. We think if ever there was a time when Democrats were going to vote against Republicans in the midterms, it was going to be this one, because they realize how vital it is because of all the damage that Trump has done in his presidency and why they are so motivated. Maybe that logic holds true for the 2014 midterms when Obama was in power, when they were nearing the end of that term, but it does not hold true for these ones. We need popular support now. The second thing to say is that we think that voters will turn out to the best politicians. If they think the Democrats are pushing people that they don't necessarily like, or they're pushing it for some abstracted political agenda, we think they are more likely not to turn out, more likely to feel frustrated, and even worse, more likely to turn out for the Republicans instead, because they think they can get more of what they want to there. The last thing they said here was that, well, the Republicans will be against Trump anyway, so we think that's fine. But we actually think now more than ever, Republicans are terrified of their own electorate, and they are likely to be supporting of Trump, and that's why these midterms are so dangerous, because of that support. Secondly, are the Democrats stale? Look, we think the Democratic platform is stale for a number of other reasons other than just race. We think it's because they've put forward older candidates, for instance, in the past, who don't identify particularly well with voters, so they do things exactly like you're talking about, where they pick out candidates who they think will be successful. We are more than willing to support the Democrats changing up that platform. We just don't think that forcing minority candidates in works that way. Lastly, on who is more likely to get the political success, they talk about how rhetoric matters and the likes. Look, we think rhetoric is actually really important, but it's also incredibly powerful when it is delivered from, if it's a white politician, if it's delivered from them, because it gets those voters who unfortunately sometimes do vote more to more relatable candidates who will be white, and makes them have far more buy-in into those immigration issues because they realise the power. But also we think that just because you're white doesn't mean you necessarily can't engage with those issues. You can talk to people within your party, you can tell stories about the immigration problems that have occurred, and you can get voter support in that regard. And lastly, they literally told us that minority voters are already voting, so I'm not sure what further buy-in they get there, and it seems to factually be the case, Clinton won big in minority candidates. 1, the obligation of the Democratic Party to the public. An important few things for context here. Never before has the context for minorities been so awful in modern political history in regards to Trump's America. We think minorities are in an incredibly dangerous position in regards to their treatment in American society and how they interact with policy. For that reason, it is absolutely vital that more than anything, the Democrats prioritise political success. And I'm going to talk to you a bit later how necessarily they get that, but it's important just at the beginning to recognise that a meritocracy is the most likely context for that to take place. The second thing to say here is that even in the case that, we think that they also need to be particularly reticent of political players who are going to work well with backers of the party who are likely to donate enough for them to have future political success going into the next presidential election. That is also incredibly important in this case. Moreover, though, we think that the Democratic Party has an overwhelming, as a party, focus on empowering as many people and protecting their rights. That is what they need to preserve in this election. For that reason, they need to do everything possible to win the midterm, to ensure that even though they might, they're not getting the presidency, they can get some form of political change, or at least stop regressive change at Congress and Senate levels. Right. Secondly, why meritocratic selection will work best. It's important to remember a few things in this case. Firstly, that minorities are already politically engaged in this context. We think you get minimum swing from them in this case, and if they aren't engaged, it's often for a number of other reasons. For instance, even some things as simple as they're working on election days, you're unlikely to change that reality in this case. We think where the swing happened in that election, though, was that moderate white voters and generally the bulk of the electorate who happen to be white in this case. For that reason, we need an incredibly good candidate who can swing them politically, but also a candidate who has appeal to that electorate and who is going to be supported by those voters. We think you get that the most when you get a candidate who is most popular with that electorate, when you get a candidate who you know is going to succeed. As well as that, we think that the kind of identity politics that the Democratic Party embarked on in the 2016 election campaign didn't seem to apply particularly well to their voter base, and if anything, galvanized support for Trump's rhetoric in regards to the kind of white genocide narratives that he empowers in America at the time. For that reason, we think you need the best possible identifying candidates for the kind of voters who swung the other way during that election. The second thing to note here is that it is just really important to have good politicians. People like Hillary Clinton made a number of political gaffes during that campaign. We think if you appoint inexperienced politicians who don't, for instance, know how to interact with the press, who don't know how to network with donors, who don't know how to get the support from within their party, they are very unlikely to have success in this political context, and you're more likely to see unbelievable upsets, even in home run states where they're likely to get support anyway. That really endangers the ability of the Democratic Party to get any change at all, and means they're unlikely to have success at all going forward. That is really problematic. Thirdly, how this empowers problematic narratives for the Republicans. Too many does. One, we think that the Democrats, firstly, the Democrats are problematic because they seem to be selecting candidates. And this is a narrative that I've already told you about. When it's seen that the party body chooses these candidates, that's really alienating for voters, and particularly for voters who like the grassroots appeal of the Democrats, who like the fact that they are the People's Party, they are supported by people, and dislike that very fact in the Republicans Party, that they're seen as a corporate machine that just selects people who are going to be public. So we think that's firstly really important to prevent Trump from being able to push that narrative, or to prevent other conservatives from being able to push that narrative. The second thing to say is that it opens them up to far more of the politically correct attacks that Trump has laid onto them in the past. That means that you get people on the margin who think that the Democrats have gone a bit too far in this regard, and means they are more likely either not to vote or to vote the other way. These are all problematic parts of how it engenders the support for the Republican Party and creates damages the Democrats in that regard. Lastly, we think it actually fuels a lot more of the really problematic narratives from Trump's end of the spectrum. So things like white genocide, the Democrats only care about minorities and the likes, are more likely to get enormous support, which not only means politically it becomes difficult for the Democrats, but in day-to-day life you are far more likely to get extremist right-wing reactions and more ticket torch rallies and the likes, and that's likely to become more problematic. We are the side that recognises this is a vital election for America in this time. We need as much chance of success as possible, and you get that when you have the best candidates possible, which we get on our side of the house.
Thank you. First negative speaker for the speech, second affirmative speaker. Here you go.
Here's the thing, right? For the people who bought the rhetoric about white genocide, they are probably unlikely to vote for the Democrats under either side of the House. That means that what the focus of the Democrats should be is getting people to come to that election in the first instance, people who would be otherwise unlikely to do so, but you can convince to do so. The way to do that best was to appeal to people in the exact same way they told us was often so persuasive. That was getting people who looked like those people, who had the same experience as those people, and who said they could accurately represent those people's lives. That is what we did. That is how we persuaded people to vote for the Democrats. They never got any of the people who were already already going to vote Trump, they never gave any support to the Democrats in this debate. I'm going to tell you 3 things in this speech. Firstly, why the next election Democrats are likely to do well, including use of standard on why it makes the Democrats better internally. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why this leads to better policy regardless of whether they are successful in the next election. Thirdly, on why, regardless of all of this, we think they have an obligation to prioritise these candidates. First on why we think they're likely to do well. Note at the start here that what we told you at MAP was that centrists really vote in this election. That is, that people who do not have strong political views or are not particularly persuaded by any narrative are unlikely to show up and vote. They said, but that's not true because of current context. Note here that that ignored what we told you, that is that midterms often have less than 50% voter turnout. That showed that people were less invested in it. But also missed the piece of analysis Matt gave you about how the Republicans are unlikely to put forward Trump-esque candidates or people placing the same kind of extremist narratives and rhetoric as Trump. What that means is that you are unlikely to see the same impetus on centrist voters to do so because they do not see the same narratives of white genocide in that election. They do not see an immediate urgency in beating that narrative, and therefore they still do not show up and vote as we told you was the current status quo for those people. But also note here that we think given that those people are unlikely to feel enfranchised by either party under the status quo, that is, those people feel that both the Republicans and the Democrats do not represent them, we think they are unlikely to show up and vote in that instance anyway. What we would prefer to do is make one group of people feel enfranchised, particularly when given that at midterms voter turnout is so low, that one group is probably enough to get them over the line. What does that look like? Firstly, you get these minorities themselves to come out and vote. Because their only response to this was to be like, but they said right now African American people don't vote, therefore they won't anyway. Ignored again what we told you about things like people being more willing to come out and vote when you have people who look like they represent you, but also when you tell people that that whole party represents them and is the mechanism for change. Because what they said here was, that people are incentivized to come out and vote against Trump. But note that ignored the fact that people also feel like the Democrats don't offer a solution for them. That is to say that they're not going to be like, we need to vote against Trump, let's vote for this other white candidate, when they feel like that still does not represent them, when they feel like that is not a suitable mechanism for change, so they are unlikely to show up and unlikely to give their support for that group. Ignore that analysis, we needed to hear a response to this. But the second thing we told you here was that we think that even centrist voters are likely to be persuaded by this, because this shows a clearer stance against the Trump-esque narrative and continuing what the Democrats already do of putting forward largely white, largely quite privileged candidates. Because at the point where lots of centrists right now are turning against that sort of thing because of things like Trump's pretty extreme policy, we think what you needed to do in that instance was to make a strong stance against that so people see that you are differentiated in that circumstance and you are likely to make better policy in that realm. At the end of that, I think we showed that minorities and centrists more generally are likely to come out and vote in this way, in a way that they are not in other circumstances. What did they tell us here? They were like, that instead people will just vote for the Republicans because they can be like, look, the Democrats aren't being a popular party. Like, I just think this is bizarre, right? Because the Republicans also aren't very, they don't like poll the public and then run those candidates. They largely run pretty privileged white people, so they also don't seem like the party of the people. But also note that we're not removing all of the other mechanisms that currently make the Democrats more of a people's party. That is, we are prioritising them for things like pre-selection and helping them with things like campaigning. That does not look like removing primaries or making it so they unilaterally select who's running for things. It was a bit of a ridiculous conception of this debate. But also note here that what we told you here was that, what we tell you here is that people are unlikely to turn to the Republicans. The debate is not whether people will vote for the Democrats or the Republicans. The debate is whether people will show up in the first instance to vote for the Republicans. That's the difference we told you we got. They never responded. At the end of that, we get people to come and vote for this party, which both sides agreed was a good thing in this debate. At that point, we win that issue. Secondly, but further on that, on substantive about why we make the Democrats better internally. Because note here that I think making the party strong internally looks like removing and freeing old power structures that largely rely on whiteness, largely rely on wealth, and often lead to things like corruption, family dynasties, and nepotism and circle jerks and that kind of thing. Why do I think you break down those structures particularly well? One, you literally just do it, because you take those people out of the top and you put in minorities in their place, or you run minorities at elections in a way that necessarily breaks down that line where you only have people who are in like a boys' club getting those positions. Note that at the point where note that when you do that, I think you also free up some of the change and you get change and get rid of some of the links along the way. That means you necessarily remove that type of corruption, necessarily remove the absolute opposite of meritocracy that they wanted to tell us existed. I think that looks like things like in the New York government election, where we we think that under our world, it would look like the Democrats prioritising a candidate like Cynthia Nixon, who we think is a minority, is also one of the most popular candidates, and arguably is more qualified, but is unlikely to win given the lack of funding. Note that that is instead of keeping the current white power structures of the incumbent, who we think has done a lot of dodgy stuff, and people are a bit like, about them, but also they have huge campaign funding, so they're likely to win. Again, this isn't a debate about which party wins that state, because we think the Democrats are likely to win New York regardless, but we think it is a debate about which candidate holds power in that, and which is most able to provide a circuit breaker in that instance. So that fell against their rhetoric about why people were likely to vote the Republicans in this instance. Second thing I tell you here is that particularly young people from both minority and non-minority groups are more likely to come out and vote for the Democrats when they look like a party who represents them. Because it was not enough in this debate to be like, but people don't think they represent them because like some other reason they're stale. It was because they weren't representative. It was because they weren't listening to their voters, and they weren't listening to particularly young people who we think otherwise are most likely to vote. That means things like young black people who right now feel like the Black Democratic Caucus does not represent them and is old and out of touch. Now people joining that party, getting A, new ideas, which we think is good for the strength of the party in the future, but B, also just thinking they're more representative and voting for them at the next election in a really strong way. At the end of that, we made the party more cohesive internally, but we also provided them more external support at the election. We win that. Secondly, on why we get better policy more generally. Note here that I don't think we need to prove that they can take Congress to the next election, or even they get more people involved, because I think it's probably just a good thing to have people running in that seat. One, because they do that thing where you like have a person to aspire to and like provide role models for people. I think that's pretty valuable because it breaks down ideas about who can and can't run for politics. Probably just a benefit, basically. But also, it sets a standard for the Democrats. That is, they should aspire to that in future elections, which means that they are unlikely to turn their back on that narrative. If these benefits eventuate at any point, regardless of the next election, I think we win this. But also note that we told you this was a benefit, because when you do have people who get elected, which we told you is likely to happen, particularly in safe places like New York, I think they are more likely to influence policy in the House and also internally in the party, because now they are more able to agitate for things, they have more media attention on them when they do. I think that is a benefit of this. The only thing I said here was like, sometimes like white men arguing against abortion like helps other white men understand it. Like, that's not the point, right? The point is that currently change is affected by those minority groups. It is women arguing against anti-abortion policies. It is not the white men who are changing the power structures. I do not think they understood what this debate was about. It was about getting people to show up at the next election. It was never about their old ideas of staleness.
Thank you, Senator, from the speaker, for that speech. Now, invite the second lady speaker, Mayor.
The reason why Hillary Clinton didn't do as well in the election as was generally supposed was the fact that, generally speaking, voters perceived her as being pushed out of a democratic machine. This the product of a political dynasty and what the Democratic Party thought people wanted. But when the Democratic Party does the exact same thing with minority candidates and says, look, we think you should be voting for these candidates, we've prepared them for you, we've rolled them out for you, that shows that there is a disconnect between what people actually want. Voters don't feel like they want to vote for establishment candidates right now. The Trump election made that pretty clear. They want to vote for people who are popular, who have good policies, and who appeal to them, not for who the party put forward to them as the correct candidate. In order to capitalize on that and to do the best in elections, Democrats need to put forward politicians that are popular, that make good policies, and will win over those centrist voters that they wanted to talk about. So a few points of rebuttal in this debate, and my split later on is going to be about why the success of the Democratic Party gets better outcomes for minorities in the long term, so we need to prioritise that over correlative benefits like role modelling. So let's have a look firstly at some rebuttals. Let's do two general areas here. Firstly, around like what's the obligation of the Democratic Party. Secondly, rules to help get Democrats elected, and then follow that the policy of the Democratic Party is then put in place in their internal power structures. So let's have a look at this first area about the obligation of the Democratic Party. So what they told us under this was essentially the Democratic Party cares about inclusivity and that should affect their nominations. Firstly, we think the Democratic Party can pretty easily discharge that by putting in place good policies for minorities. We think they'd do that better under our rule, which I'll expand on. But secondly, we think that that's presumably a guarantee that even if they elect white candidates, they will probably do things that are generally good for minorities. because they already have that existing platform, they already do those things in the first place. So we don't necessarily think there's a massive harm to the Democratic Party's obligation to inclusivity and policies around that under our side of the House. So the second idea that we brought you, and one we think is a strong principle, is that the Democratic Party cares about bringing the best policies to people, about protecting the rights and goods of the vast majority of people. And to a degree, that means that they have to care about success. They have to care about doing well and getting those policies and getting those people into election. We think that's really, really important in the current climate we have, where minorities are being harmed, where they're facing a lot of negative rhetoric from Trump voters. We need to get more people in place who are willing to stand up for them. That means winning seats for the Democrats at this side of the House. So let's have a look at this next area about what helps Democrats get elected. So the first, the general thing about this has been about voter turnout we've had from them. They've given us this characterization that centrists are unlikely to turn out to vote, so we need to appeal to progressives minority candidates. Well, the thing to say here is that progressives are likely going to vote for the Democratic Party anyway. They're not people who are talking about that are going to go out and vote and then jump ship to Republican candidates. So the people we're talking about are, generally speaking, if not centrist, people that are on the margins. We think those are the people who are going to be particularly affected by this type of policy. We think that's firstly because they're turned off by what they see as as the Democratic Party trying to provide them the correct person for them to vote for. And secondly, we think that's because they're more likely turned off by overly PC rhetoric that Liam told you about in his speech, like the idea that people are just putting forward minority candidates because that's the correct thing to do. I think that generally speaks to what's happened to the left-wing movement generally within America, is that they are losing support broadly because people see them as only really appealing to minorities, being a bit snowflakey, being a bit PC, and everything a white man does must necessarily be bad. And we think that that's the kind of policy that's going to turn off those marginal people, that people that really, really matter in an election that's likely going to be low turnout, basically no matter what. That means we need to put in place a broadly appealing candidate, one that's seen as being put forward because they have the best policies and is perceived as going to be the best politician. That's going to get those marginal voters, not just having a minority candidate in place. They had this that, people who buy into white genocide aren't going to change. Obviously, white genocidists aren't going to really buy into the Democratic Party at all. We're just talking about those people who maybe are white, maybe are centrist, but they feel insecure with the Democratic Party right now because they feel like they're under attack by those kind of policies. That might be an irrational thing, but it's how those people feel, and the Democratic Party needs to talk to those people in order to have not be won over by populist rhetoric. And the last thing here to say is that essentially they gave us this narrative that minority people necessarily always vote for people who they can relate to. There's a couple of responses to this. First, we think that largely minority people, like Latinos, generally speaking, will always vote Democratic. But secondly, we think that they, like anyone, often vote on policy and vote rationally. They don't just go, oh, look, that person looks like me, therefore I must vote for them. And we think they do that. There's examples like how Hillary Clinton didn't necessarily do as well with women as anyone expected, because people were like, I don't like her despite the fact she's a woman. And we think that in a tight election, it's not the opportunity to throw away these things on things that aren't necessarily guarantees the best way to win. It's going to be through going good policies, broadly appealing candidates who are people being turned off by PC policies. So lastly, this area about the impact on the party itself. What they told us here was that this will help to destroy old boys' power structure. Obviously, that was contingent on people getting elected in the first place. We told you why that's way less likely to happen. But secondly, we think that even in this case where they do get elected, that really is going to undermine their platform within the party, because they're going to be seen by other politicians as being the AA, and they're not going to actually care about what they want to say. They're sure it's going only coming in through affirmative action, through a Democratic Party pushing them forward artificially when there might be other better candidates. That means they're unlikely to be well respected by their peers and not likely to break down the power structure. So let's have a look at my split then. About why the success of the Democratic Party gets better outcomes for minorities long term. This will broadly deal with the things that they brought up in the last minute of their second speech around things like role modeling benefits and respond directly to that. So we think that there's obviously potentially those benefits they wanted to talk about having things like role models and people seeing out and do politics when you have minority candidates. But it's pretty clear that those benefits are pretty marginal when compared to actually getting Democratic people into seats. And I'm going to explain why that is. So we think that, first of all, it's not as significant because we need to get Democrats into power, because that creates better policy change that can help the root of the problems that mean it's more difficult for minorities to get into politics in the first place. I think that's far more important. So that means we need to get a Democrat into power, whether or not that's someone who is white or someone who is a minority, that they can do things like put in place policies, say, for example, expanding education in areas which have minorities. They can do things that put in place programs that combat inaccessibility to voting and things like that, like issues around gerrymandering, voting booth issues, and areas where like people are, like, for example, working so they can't get out and vote. We think that any Democrat can essentially do that and can go and are likely to do that because of the party's platform of inclusivity. And the outcome of them doing that is it creates a whole lot more actual substantive change for minority groups. So we think that's really, really important because the Democratic Party needs to prioritise what happens to these minority groups in their actual lives over having a role model that they can look at on TV and go like, oh, maybe I can be like that. We think it's more important for the Democratic Party to go after what's impacting people when they go about their lives because they can't necessarily succeed, they're not doing as well because of this discrimination. We think that's a way more important impact than having someone up on a television screen that a black person can look at and go like, maybe in this someday that'll be me, but they can't actually access it because it's all a kind of superficial level. And we think that's really, really helpful because then that creates a kind of organic change that means that minorities are more likely to then succeed in politics later on and to be that candidate that people view as the most qualified because they're no longer discriminated against as much. They no longer have these institutional barriers that maybe prevented them from getting the same level of qualifications. And that's really, really important because then we have those strong minority candidates that aren't just actively fielded but are clearly the best candidate for the Democratic Party to put forward. We think that's the better kind of change and it might take a little bit of a longer time. We think it's far more likely to be successful for the Democratic Party in the long term to actually help minorities where they're so often disadvantaged. This is clearly an important element to the space. I don't think any team doesn't think that minorities aren't an important group that we need to look out for. At the end of this debate, we think the key to help minorities to succeed is to get Democrats into power. They're the party that's likely going to look out for them. I think that means in some cases going after the candidate that is going to win, regardless of whether or not they're a minority. That's the most important thing to remember in this debate.
Thank you, second native speaker. Now to invite the third speaker from the side of the player.
The problem right now is that Democrats were not seen as a solution by a lot of voters. We saw statistics of people turning out in thousands and thousands to protest against Trump, and yet primaries across the country were not showing Democrats necessarily winning that same proportion of the vote. People were not turning out to volunteer for the Democrats. We were not supporting them in Congress. And that was the important nuance we brought you at first and at second, was that right now, even though people on the progressive left agreed on the problem, they were not agreed on the solution because of all the reasons they gave you. People didn't like Hillary. People thought the Democrats were corporate and not based on merit. And that was the circuit breaker we gave you. Because note in that case, they just asserted that somehow magically the groupthink on the Democrats being unmeritorious, corporate, white, and stale would just change without giving you literally any reason why that would happen. We gave you a circuit breaker. We told you how people would change the power structures, how it would capture more of a vote. A few questions. Firstly, let's talk about the image problems of the Democrats, and then I'll explain how that translates to more votes on our side of the House, which we think is really important. The first thing the vote side said was that the Democrats were unrepresented. I think it's important to connect with the voice. And they were just saying, oh, but white men can talk about abortion and they can be persuasive. The problem is, people naturally in a campaign are more receptive to an emotive language. All studies in campaigning show that talking about your experience and connecting with someone on common shared interest is the most persuasive way to win their vote. So that was why, sure, maybe white men could convince some people that abortion was fine. The difference is when you had women candidates or when you had black candidates talking about police violence, they necessarily emulated that experience more. They could talk about their own experience and understanding. That was always going to be more persuasive and more emotive. I think we can all say in an instance when we've seen an African-American person talk about gun violence versus a white person, and have said that intuitively you feel more empathy from the person speaking from their own experience. That was the nuance. Then they were like, well, you just don't vote for who you want. Not all women voted Hillary, notably more voted for Hillary than they voted for the male candidates, particularly in the Sanders-Hillary comparison, right? Women overwhelmingly picked Hillary over Bernie Sanders because of that common experience. I think Hillary, maybe there were some other reasons I didn't like her, like email scandal type stuff, right? Maybe that's not the best example for a candidate, and I'll talk a bit more about Hillary later. But the important thing to say is, particularly with primary elections, when you're voting for a local representative, someone to represent your area, if you're in an election that's primary African American, and the Democrats say, we care about you, and keep running a white person, I don't think you are likely to turn up and vote for them. Because even different to the presidential election, you're voting for someone who you want to represent you. That means you are less likely to turn out for a local representative who does not fulfill the basic role that's within their name. That was why we talked about that image problem change. The second thing we talked about was corporate money and structure. They even considered this at first when they were like, this might lose them big corporate donations. We think that buys into their own rhetoric about the Democrats being corporate. Because during the presidential election, Hillary had way more money but still lost because people do not like how corporate the Democrats are. We think when you say we are prioritising minority groups, people from the ground, people from the community, that changes their rhetoric. Laura gave you substantive information, substantive material about how this breaks down those power structures within the Democratic Party that have existed for generations and decades. They conceded that legacies were a bad thing. This is the only mechanism to break down legacies by pushing people into those higher up roles who are not part of that existing white, rich power structure. That was why we got rid of that terrible corporate image that was hamstringing the Democrats. They gave no mechanism. The third thing was meritocracy. They were like, but this isn't meritocratic. Clearly they didn't read the topic slide or listen to our case, because we were not just plopping people in seats willy-nilly. We were still existing in the same power structure, right? It was about prioritising particular candidates. That was encouraging people to run. That was giving money and giving airtime. That was things like in the governor election in New York, the current Democratic power structures like Nancy Pelosi are backing in the incumbent or the more progressive minority Cynthia Nixon candidate. That was what changed. It wasn't saying we're just picking people and putting them into seats. It was prioritising those candidates with minority experience in a lot of cases. That was the nuance that they missed. But the important thing to say is all of their rhetoric just buys into this idea that minority groups are not meritocratic. Like, we think if you're running to be governor or you're running to be a member of Congress from the state, you're probably pretty good, right? Like, you've probably done some shit that people appreciate. This was just Trump rhetoric, say black people can't have merit. That was absolutely terrible, because what we were doing wasn't putting in less meritorious candidates. We were obviously countering the privilege that non-meritorious white candidates, non-meritorious men, non-meritorious straight candidates have, and that was why we were still achieving meritocracy. But at the point they told you that right now the Democrats already had that image problem, it was unclear how that image problem got any worse when we put a change in place and still had things like primaries. The fourth thing you say was on political correctness. We think if you're someone who is persuaded by the narrative that the Democrats being too politically correct, you probably vote Republican. They tried to say, oh, that was glib, that's saying just right-wing people. No. We think that by and large, if you're someone who's persuaded by that rhetoric, you probably vote Republicans. But the second thing to say is that damage has been done. Like, Trump has leveraged that argument. We don't think it has a lot of persuasion in the public sphere anymore. He said it a lot of times. But the other thing to say is, if that image problem exists now, I think maybe the only thing to counterbalance is just to have a strong narrative against it. Because right now, the Democrats just buy into Trump's rhetoric. That's why we're not going to win them any votes anyway. They're being like, actually, Trump is right. We're too politically correct. Whoops. Like, unclear how that wins them any votes. If anything wins Trump more votes. So that was silly. And I think that culminates in a really important thing. People see, if you pardon my language, the Democrats as piss weak. They don't have a strong stance, they are divided, they don't have a strong narrative. I think a lot of people like Sanders voters, people who voted for Trump, wanted a strong message that was emotive, that was inspiring, that got to them the vote. That's how Trump won, because he did something new, he connected with voters in a way that was unique. I think right now the Democrats give me this stale image that is not representative, that is not emotive, that does not connect, does not change anything, because right now they say some things and their action does not correlate, they're conflated. I think the only way that they're going to win is by taking a strong stance in the favour of this policy. How does that connect to votes? They said progressives vote anyway, and we gave you a lot of reasons why they don't. Firstly, factually, progressives, particularly African American voters, turn out far less in primaries. We told you often midterms have less than 50% voter turnout. But the second thing I told you in my introduction is people do not see the Democratic Party as the change for good. So even if people are progressive, they'll turn to things like Black Lives Matter rather than the Democrats. We think obviously you need both because change has to come within Congress. We think, and secondly on centrists, let's win this argument as well. Because we told you that centrists often, when they were so conflicted, did not come out to vote. This message was not persuasive. They failed to see any substantive difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. They either don't vote or they just err on the side of Trump's rhetoric. We need to counter that. We also gave you material that had this captures centrist minorities who don't identify with the left but do want to see themselves represented. No response. Secondly, on policy, which got a really weak response because we thought this was really significant, that by against things like the immigration policy, like the deaths of African American voters. We also think these people are more persuasive in the public eye. They're seen as more legitimate. So the Democrats campaign on refugee and immigrant issues, but don't have anyone from that background speaking up. We think it undermines their legitimacy, and that's when people think they're just progressives wanking off for the sake of it, rather than people talking from a position of authority. We need some response to policy because we thought that was important. Finally, on obligation, they responded to neither of our second two prongs about principle, because we told you when you're supported by minorities and when you actively leverage their vote to get you in, you have to reciprocate that in the way you represent them. They just said the obligations fulfilled by policy. Firstly, they didn't prove the policy thing, but secondly, we still think you need to counter the privilege that's part of your obligation as being a party that stands for minorities. At the end of this speech, the negative team have failed to prove any metric by which the Democrats can change their image. We gave you a circuit breaker where minorities get in charge, they get voices, we win their votes. I'm so proud to propose.
Thank you, the affirmative. Now I can call the negative speaker. Here.
We think there's been significant confusion from the affirmative side of the House on the way party leaderships work and are involved in the selection and endorsement of candidates, and also what it was we stood for on this side of the House. So I'm going to spend the first few minutes just clarifying both of those things. There are multiple systems that party leaderships can use to select and endorse candidates when they campaign for elections. The most centralized versions of the way that party leaderships do this involves Nancy Pelosi and party elites having a disproportionate say in the way that candidates are selected and the candidates that they're going to field. To be clear, that is the status quo in the way that the Democratic Party currently elects its candidates. There are other ways that party leaderships can select candidates that involve more participation, more communication with local branches of government, and not involving individuals that they have connections with themselves. So to be very clear, when the affirmative side of the House said that the problem with the Democratic Party until now has been the staleness of its policy, they were actually incorrect. The staleness of their policy is a symptom of the problem, which is that the party elite and the leaders are unwilling to listen to the voices of other individuals who might be viable candidates. What does this look like in terms of examples? Who would we support and not support? In the recent elections in New York for, I believe, Congress, when Alexandria Cortez, a minority candidate, upset the incumbent Democratic candidate who was being supported by the Democratic Party, we say that is a problem with the Democratic Party, that they should have been supporting Alexandria Cortez, because it was quite clear that she was going to win that election. In the case of Cynthia Nixon, we would not be happy for the Democratic Party leadership to support her, because even though she's a minority candidate, it is unlikely that she's going to win, and that means that they're not going to be affect policy at the most important levels. That was the distinction. So we did support change in the Democratic Party that involved them putting their ear to the ground and changing the way that they dealt with candidates. Two issues in this speech then. First, I'm going to talk about the obligation on the Democratic Party and the way that affects who they should endorse. And second, I'm going to talk about how this is going to affect success in the midterm elections, which we told you was the most important issue in this debate. First, in terms of obligation, let's talk about what we heard from the affirmative side. They told us that the Democratic Party has a principled obligation because it has historically represented inclusivity and it's historically relied on the votes of these minorities and marginalized peoples. Understand that this analysis doesn't actually provide any links as to why they are obliged to field these candidates. I'll explain why now. In terms of inclusivity, there are also a huge number of people, the majority of people that support the Democratic Party, who are not minority candidates. They also have a responsibility to be inclusive of these individuals. So at the point we have affirmative action policies that are going to necessarily mean that minority candidates take the place of other individuals that white Democratic voters have historically supported, we say that you are actually not upholding that principle of inclusivity, and we do that better. But the second thing to say here is that their analysis about how we've historically relied on minority voters doesn't mean that the Democratic Party is principally obliged to field those candidates. It means that they are principally obliged to do whatever they can to achieve, to gain power in Congress so that they can actually help the circumstances of those minorities. At the point where you are taking the votes of minority candidates and using them in a way that is deliberately going to get you less power in Congress, you are actually going completely against the principle that they wanted to set up, because you are taking the votes of people who rely on you and telling them that you're not going to make their life better. That side of the House's principle never stood in this debate. That's why the previous speaker didn't need to respond to it for any huge amount of time. What did we tell you on our side of the House, though, in terms of a principle that was separate from the practical outcomes of the election? We told you that the way the Democratic Party should select and endorse candidates should always stray away from anointing particular candidates at the level of the party leadership that are then pushed upon the Democratic base and told that these are the people that are going to be most successful for you. The principle that we stood for was one where the Democratic leadership divests a huge amount of sway that it currently has in these decisions and takes in more of an input from people on the ground, from local branches of government. And in those cases, we think that the Democratic Party leadership should bend to those wills. When it's clear that people like Alexandria Cortez are going to win, it should put its full backing behind those people. So that's very clear. That's what we thought the principle was in this debate. At the end of this point, most of their principal material was actually contingent on benefiting people and minorities. What we told you was completely exempt from those consequences, and we told you that the way they should run their party is a way that listens to people. Moving on to success in the midterm elections. The reason we thought this was the most important point in the debate is what Liam told you in his speech, that the current political climate is the worst, and the current climate in the United States is the worst that it has been for people who are minorities. And what this means is that the most important outcome in this debate is achieving power in things like Congress and the Senate so that you can put up meaningful resistance to the measures that this administration has taken to oppress those minorities. Let's talk about the arguments under this. The first thing they wanted to tell us that sort of fell out of the last speech was that Republican candidates will run on a more traditional platform, not based on what Trump has been running on. This is completely false, and it's demonstrably false in the way that Republicans running for Congress have started to behave. They've been inspired by the way that Trump, by the vitriol and stuff that Trump has been saying, and this has been apparent because huge amounts of Republican candidates are now unwilling to associate themselves with the RNC, who has clearly failed at fighting back in terms of Trump's policies and his beliefs in the presidency. Huge amounts of Republican candidates these days are running on a platform that is similar to Trump's in the way that it is extremist, in the way that it's sensationalist. So that means that you're not going. The outcome of this point is they told you that people are going to they're going to turn to Republicans, and that's a bad thing. That's clearly not going to happen. We still have some sort of sway there. The second thing they wanted to tell you was that centrists really vote. Centrists rarely vote. I think it's telling that they wanted to cut this huge group of people out of the debate from the very beginning, probably because they realized it's not a great group for them. Why is this the case? Why is it the case that centrists are incredibly important and probably the most important people we need to care about in terms of this election? The reason that Hillary Clinton lost the presidential election that was almost a shoo-in, that everyone thought she was guaranteed to win, is because states and individuals who have historically been blue in terms of their vote were unwilling to support her and switched their vote to red. Why is this the case? Literally, both my previous speakers told you in their introduction, and I flagged it in mine as well, that the reason that they separated themselves from the Democratic Party and were willing enough to vote red after that was that they disliked the fact that Hillary Clinton was an established candidate that was endorsed by the party leadership to the detriment of other candidates like Bernie Sanders, who might have had popular support but not that level of connection. The reason they then were willing to swing to red is because Donald Trump's whole message was to defy Republicans who had been long-standing, dynasty sorts of candidates like Jeb Bush and others. What this means in the debate is that there is a huge group of centrist voters that are willing to swing their vote between parties, and that in order to get their vote, we need to change a system that the Democratic Party currently upholds, which is similar to that of the Republicans, where they anoint leaders. What we want on our side of the House is for that to change. Centrists are important. The way we told you they're going to be affected negatively under their side of the House is that they actually get turned off, not only by the fact that the Democratic Party is equally sort of elitist and a club in terms of the way it selects its people, but also that when you prioritize minority candidates, huge amounts of centrists who have now turned red and buy into some of Trump's rhetoric are going to be turned off by that overly PC rhetoric that says that minority candidates are valuable simply because of the color of their skin and nothing else. We say that that's actually the offensive message in this debate. It says that these individuals deserve this position just because of the color of their skin. What we say on our side of the House is that when minority candidates are able to gain support through the policies that they have and through the kinds of messages they're able to advocate for, then we would be happy to support them. It's important to note that this also sort of rebuts a lot of their analysis about minority candidates being the most effective advocates for issues. In cases where that's demonstrably true, we think the Democratic Party should support them. In cases where it's not, we actually think that white candidates, or majority candidates, can be incredibly effective for this, and I'll tell you why. It's actually incredibly empowering to see white male candidates trying to connect with minorities in terms of issues that they're advocating for, and that's why this point, when they tried to rebut this point, it didn't really make sense. At the end of this debate, I don't think it's clear that they understood what we stood for in this debate and the way we wanted to see the Democratic Party change. We think that's always going to be better for minorities, and that's why we're proud to oppose.
Thank you,
that team literally conceded at multiple points in this debate that the kind of machine politics that the Democrats support are the reason they lost this election. And on our side of the House, we don't necessarily have to support them staying with this machine politics. They're a party that can evolve and change. But let's assume for a moment that they do remain with that. Where does that become more likely, less likely to have support? Where does that become more likely to alienate voters? On their side of the House, because they fucking make it worse, which is what we told you multiple times in this debate, and they just couldn't engage with. That was an absurd characterization, and they can, restate the same responses all through their case as much as they want to, but it doesn't gain any ground in this debate. 3 points. Firstly, what the obligation on the Democrats is. Secondly, who is more likely to have success. And thirdly, what works best for minorities. Firstly, on obligations for the Democrats. Look, we think most of this is fairly contingent anyway and that it's outcome-driven in this debate. But what we would say is that if the Democrats were ever going to turn an election into a science experiment on what works well in elections, this was not the one. This was the election to play it safe, to get candidates where they can, to get as much support as they can. Because they're likely to have a lot of voters swinging back onto their side who are terrified of Trump, and those are the kind of voters that they turn away. And I'm going to talk to you a bit more specifically about those voters in my next point. That's that point there. Secondly, who is more likely to have success? It's important in this case to know where did Democrats lose this election, the last election. They lost it on Rust Belt blue voters who have in the past, as much as they said they weren't, have voted Democrat, but have been alienated by some of the machine politics that they've got, and in particular a lot of the identity politicking messages that they've got from that party. And that doesn't mean they're not Democrats. They can still support a number of liberal reforms. It just means they don't buy in as effectively to that rhetoric or find those candidates as relatable. And we think that those people are the most likely to be turned away by these policies, most likely to go back to buying into Trump's rhetoric when you introduce things like that. For that reason, we think it's important to get them. And who the fuck cares if they don't buy into your college liberal view of the world in this case? We think if they vote positively for the Democrats, that means you've got more people advancing policy for you in Congress and the Senate, and that's what actually matters in this debate. That's what actually matters in that regard. You're probably more likely to free Bobby Schmurda. Secondly, we think in regards to the rhetoric of the politicians here, they told you that politicians are more likely to be successful in this regard, more likely to relate to their voters. We actually think a lot of minority voters respond really well to outreach by white politicians, but that also assumes that in this case we're the Ku Klux Klan Democrat Party that's supporting rolling out white candidates everywhere. We can still support rolling out Democratic Party candidates who are minorities where they're effective, where that cut through gets buy-in. We were never the team that had to support that on our side of the House, and we told you that multiple times. We think that exists on both sides of the House. What we support, the difference is the more popular candidate in any case, not just pushing someone who fits your identity beliefs in that regard. So that's important there. The next thing they said was that, that gives you better politicians. We actually think, for that team to have to stand for anything in this debate, they presumably have to stand for pushing some people who are probably worse politicians in some case, because we're the usual decision would make, They have to get some change in that regard. And to that extent, we think you get necessarily worse politicians. Those are more likely people who make mistakes like putting emails on an unsecured server, or who have bad press engagement with the public, or who make bad decisions like that. So that team has to stand behind those fuck-ups and justify them to the Republican Party, which makes it even more difficult. Lastly, what works best for minorities? We talked to you a lot about how this undermines the platform of minorities in the party when they're seen as affirmative action selections. That team got caught up, so we think that probably needs to be dealt with at some point in the debate. As well as that, we told you that what actually matters to these minority politicians is people within that community actually getting change in their society, actually enabling that sort of change to occur, and you're more likely to have that success in the future.
If their problem was power structures in things like primaries, pushing poor candidates on the Democratic side, I am honestly unsure what changes on their side of the House. Because if Nancy Pelosi is currently anointing their own agenda and pushing their own candidate, I'm unsure as to why that will continue.
Because the problem is that people view the power structures that exist within the Democratic Party as these old white people who are constantly pushing their own agenda and pushing their own candidates. We gave you that power structure and we gave you that circuit breaker change at the point at which those people pushed different candidates who was a refreshing image of that party. Because those minority candidates were the people who were better able to relate with voters who were going out and campaigning and protesting about certain issues. They could harness that African American vote that was unlikely to turn out in the first place. That was always why they were more likely to do better. Two things in this reply. Firstly, will the Democrats do better at the midterms? Secondly, what did this do for the party and policy outcomes? So firstly, on whether they'll do well in the midterms. What do we tell them? That it was important to mobilise people and to come out to vote. That was more likely to happen at the point at which you pushed these minority candidates because they were more likely to be relatable to the people that we needed to gain that vote from. The African American community who currently did not see the Democrats as a solution to their problem. Because that was the image problem that the Democrats had that only changed when you created minorities. But then we also told you that you could use more powerful rhetoric at the point in which you talked about personal experiences and stories. They wanted to say that people are motivated anyway because of Trump, but the problem was that wasn't what these Republicans were likely to be campaigning on. It was likely to be more traditional. Jeb Bush would still campaign on what Jeb Bush wanted to campaign on. But then even if that wasn't true, it was important in pushing back against that rhetoric that he was likely to use in those elections that could only happen at the point at which you talked about your own experience. They wanted to say that it was important to have a meritocracy so it wasn't seen as a corporate machine. That belied three responses that we gave you down our bench. The first was that the nuance of the power structures that exist within the Democratic Party was that they were seen as stale, old white dudes who were just pushing their own agenda. That changed at the point at which you put these minorities in. Then there was far more likely to view us as a meritocracy because the problem was that it was these old white people who were getting in the first place. But then even if nothing changed on that side of the house, we needed that change. Secondly, what does this do for the party and policy outcomes? Because we told you that policy outcomes were far more likely to get better at the point at which these were more minorities in Congress. And I wanted to note that was unlikely and uncontingent on what would happen in those midterms because it was likely that the Democrats would put these candidates in shoe-in seats so they were likely to get in. Because it was likely that they were able to provide a check and balance on policy, but then they were better able to argue against really poor, problematic policy that Trump put forward, like the immigration platform. They wanted to say that they wouldn't get in the first place. That belied the fact that they would do well at the midterms, but even if that weren't true, they were always more likely to get more people in there in the first place. Then at Laura, we told you that you actually improve party actions and the way in which the party operates, because you break down the archaic structures of nepotism and family legacies that was always problematic in the way in which people viewed the Democratic Party, because you put new minorities into those positions of power within the parliament. They wanted to stand for organic change, but we needed change now to absolutely address the fundamental problems that were existing for minorities within the United States of America. It was an obligation that the Democratic Party had to act against the power structures of old white people that existed within the Democratic Party. That did not change under their side of the house. The only point at which that changed was when you put these minority people into power, when you gave them the structures and the support that they required. At the end of the day, the Democrats were so much more likely to do better at the midterm elections at the point at which you gave them that power, the motion stood.